Hi, today we're going to be talking about fret slotting templates. If you're not familiar with this fret slotting jig, the idea is that we have a template, some double-sided sticky tape, and we attach it to the fretboard blank. But this one isn't even radius, but I'm not actually going to be cutting these slots. The template has a bunch of notches cut into the top edge, and they are going to engage with an index pin that sticks in from the bottom inside edge of the jig. What happens is that we slide the work in, lift it up slightly, engage the pin into the first notch, glide our saw in between these two height adjustable bearings, cut our slot, and the depth is controlled by the height of those bearings touching against the bar that runs along the top of the saw. Once we're done with the first one, we lift it up, engage the pin into the second notch, and do the same thing again. So on and so forth up the fretboard. Now you can buy these templates for all of the popular scale lengths, and that's probably the best way to go. Unless you want to build lots of guitars of different scale lengths in which the expenses will mount up, or you want to experiment with some not so common scale lengths, and then finding the templates might be a bit more difficult. With that in mind, I decided that I was going to make my own, and I'm going to show you how. The first thing we're going to need is some aluminium flat bar. Mine comes in 50 by 3mm, which is a bit of an issue because the jig comes from the States and has a 3-inch channel width. Not a problem, I made myself a spacer bar and now everything fits smoothly and snug. The next thing we need, after choosing our scale length, is the measurements of all the fret positions. I recommend the StewMac Fret Position Calculator website. It's easy to use and it gives you two columns, the distance from the nut and the fret to fret distance. We're going to need both of those sets of measurements. The final thing we need is a way of transferring those measurements onto the blank. And for that, I use a really big set of calipers. But I reckon they're a bit awkward. So I've made myself this jig. It's just a platform. It's got this free floating piece with a channel in it. All the spaces and distances are strategically chosen. There's an aluminium edge here and another little piece of aluminium flat bar bolted to the tabletop. We take our blank, we slot it in there. It's a bit tight, and there. We take the calipers and position them just so. This channel keeps the shaft perfectly parallel, and we then clamp the top jaw to the blank like so. Now we are free to move this jaw back and forth along the shaft. Once we get to here, we can move that piece to the inside. And the benefit of such a big set of calipers is that we never need to re-zero. When you're using something like this and you run out of space and you have to say, okay, well, our zero is now that fret, and do all of the arithmetic and the positioning, and it just doesn't work out very well. And if you've ever done this, you'll know what I mean. This set will do pretty much an electric guitar, you know, up to the 24th fret if you want. The only thing it won't do in one go is an acoustic bass guitar. We will have to re-zero just for the final 2 or 3 frets, which are decorative anyway on a bass guitar, an acoustic one at least. So now the process is to take a compass spike take our set of measurements, move the large set of calipers to the position on our list, and then using our second set of calipers, the regular everyday set, we check the fret to fret position. This double checking is essential, trust me, because it is really easy to get just a little bit lost and to miss it by 1 millimeter or 2. And moving the large set of calipers to the next fret position and then checking the distance between that and the previous fret position will save your bacon a number of times over. That is why we need the 2 columns of numbers. So let's do it for real. I've marked out the first fret position, but we haven't done the 0 one first. So the 0 is done by scoring against the upper jaw. Then the first fret, like so. And for this, I then measure the distance between the first and second fret and double check before marking. It's at this point that the movable jaw starts bumping into our floating parallelizer, so I'm going to need to swap it around so that it's on the inside. After moving the calipers, I just double checked the last measurement just to make sure that we're absolutely perfectly aligned. And now we can continue up the rest of the fretboard. That's the last one. This is what it looks like. And those lines are accurate to better than 0.1 of a millimetre. This is the last time that those positions will be right to that degree of accuracy, because now we've got to cut the slots. And that's a bit of an issue. I cut the notches on all of my previous templates using the bandsaw. It is not ideal. Granted, this has a very high quality mitre that is very tight in the T-slot. I laid a strip of masking tape along the table, and then I would line up very carefully the scratched line with the edge of the masking tape, come in and cut a slot. If I get it perfect, it is accurate. The big problem is that even though this is a 19-inch bandsaw, that means that there is just slightly more than 18 inches of clearance before the pillar. That is not even enough for a short scale guitar, let alone a regular scale or a bass. What I then needed to do was to transfer these lines to the other side of the work, flip it around and come in and start cutting. But not so fast, because I need to cut on the other side of the scratch. Because we flipped it around, I would need to move my piece of masking tape or estimate the width of the curve of the blade. So all in all, that is not very satisfactory, and I would generally arrange to do that flip over up at the high end of the frets, because I was not making widdly woo guitars. This micro table saw, let's face it, it's a toy. It has no power. the mitre is very unsteady. On the other hand, we don't need a lot of power to cut these notches. We can improve the performance of the mitre, and it has a good chatter-free carbide-tipped blade. What I've done is taken some magic tape and I've laid a strip along here and along here, just folded it top and bottom. Next, I turn the mitre around back to front, and that means that any unsteadiness in the mitre results in movement at the back here, not at the point of cutting. Unfortunately, this blade is not a perfect kerf width to match the pin that it will be engaging with. It's too narrow. But I believe I've come up with a way of solving that problem too. I've been doing a few practice runs on a piece of scrap. I'll show you what I'm up to. I bring the work up to the blade in between two teeth so that one of the teeth is lying on top of the work. I then slide it along so that the edge of the blade aligns perfectly with the scratched line. Now, as I mentioned, the notch is now a little bit too narrow, so I slide it up again, this time in between two teeth, and I slide it sideways so that the opposite edge of the notch just touches the body of the blade. Remember that the body is narrower than the carbide teeth. That allows us to widen it by a very precise amount. And that allows the notch to engage with the index pin with no play. For the very first notch, there's a bit of a problem because the piece at the end is too short to engage with the mitre and hold it steady. I'm attempting to solve that by putting down a couple of layers of oven paper. Now hopefully that'll be the last one where I need to wing it. That corresponds to the 0 fret, or the nut, and a little bit of play there doesn't actually hurt. It turns out that something about this metallic silver coating or paint either interacts with aluminium dust very badly, or some other problem. It was binding very, very terribly, which doesn't allow for easily cutting the notches precisely. I seem to have worked it around by putting some masking tape down here. I'll press on and see how far we get with that. After checking all of those notches with my magnifiers, I'm happy with all of them except the 12th fret, which is about 0.1 or 2 of a millimetre that way. That corresponds to about 1 cent of pitch. So I've left myself a note, if I care about that, to play all of the notches in this direction hard up against the pin, but for the 12th fret, just play it the other way. That should correct for that. So I've just left myself a little note to remind myself to do so. On all of the notches that I cut perfectly, there has been close to zero play. On the others, I have been leaning the piece that way, but we have now come to the 12th fret, and so I'm leaning it that way. There's about 0.1, perhaps 0.15 of a millimetre in it, but yep, the more accurate the better. Now back to leaning the rest of them that way, if there is any play at all. And finally here we are on the 0th fret, or nut end if you prefer, and there's the tiniest bit of play in it, and I'm going to lean it that way because a lot of luthiers shave a tiny bit off the nut end of their fingerboards for intonation reasons. There we are. Job finished. I've just been double checking that the slots that I cut match up with the lines that I scribed, particularly on that 12th fret, and yes, they're as close as I could possibly hope them to be. So all in all, using that little toy table saw is a big step forward, and I would recommend it to anybody. Unless you can think of a better method, comment below. My name's Trevor Magnuson. Check back from time to time. Cheers.